Welcome, Dan Hannan, MEP, to the Centre for Independent Studies. We're very privileged to have you with us. We've had a series of events for your visit, which have all been great successes. But here we can share with some of our viewers a few of the insights that you've offered at our many events during your trips. So thank you for being here. You've talked a lot about how the American Bill of Rights essentially codifies important elements of the Magna Carta and made the point that Britain essentially has a Bill of Rights it's almost forgotten. Australia then too, I guess, has a Bill of Rights we've almost forgotten. Do you think we need a Bill of Rights?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same one. I mean, it was the common heritage of Australia and Britain and indeed the United States. I mean, the US Constitution, I can't quite say cut and pasted the Bill of Rights because they weren't literally cutting and pasting, but if they'd had the technology, you know, a lot of it is word for word identical. And what those documents are is restraints on government, democratic restraints and legal restraints. They reinforce the idea that the law isn't what the government says it is, that the law is this huge, intangible but powerful force that binds the strongest people just as surely as it binds the poorest. And that's the essence, if you like, of the Anglosphere miracle. It's a government of laws, not of men, as John Adams put it. Do we need one? Well, I'm perfectly happy with the one we've got, which guarantees legislative supremacy over the executive, parliamentary privilege, and contained the germ of freedom of the press and liberty of conscience and all the other things that we now take for granted as part of our heritage.
And how should we give due recognition to those rights in the Magna Carta, which would form our Bill of Rights?
Well, you know, the really interesting thing is that on all of the occasions when these documents were put forward, the 1689 Bill of Rights, the US Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, our temptation, looking at it from today, is to think these were revolutionary documents. These were forward-looking, modern, innovative charters. But that wasn't how the authors looked at them. In every case, they said, we're not inventing any new rights. We are reasserting traditional rights. And that was what the word revolution used to mean. The etymology has changed a bit, or the implications have changed a bit. But in the 18th century, revolution meant a full turn of the wheel. It meant a setting upright of that which has been turned on its head. So they were saying, you know, if you take the Americans, they were saying there has been an imbalancing of our Constitution because the Crown is doing things that it ought not to do, and our revolution is to restore the rights and liberties of the freeborn Englishman. That was as they called themselves and thought of themselves. So, you know, I'm always hugely suspicious of people who come at these charters now and say, well, we need to create new rights for disabled people or asylum seekers or whatever. All we need to do is preserve equality before the law, freedom from state coercion, and the notion that the state is the servant of the individual rather than the other way around.
What do you think has happened to the instinct that drove those people? We now see a growing government in our lives and the erosion of these personal liberties that you've written so much about. Why do you think we're not made of the same stuff as those people who decided the revolution of the wheel was necessary?
I think we probably are. Government tends to grow because of the phenomenon that economists call dispersed costs and concentrated gains. We are much more likely to notice the benefits that we get from the state than we are to notice our small share in the tax system, hidden in the tax system, in the pay-as-you-earn system of paying for those things. So governments, by their nature, are always going to be growing in order to sustain their support. But that doesn't make me despair, because the private sector is always smarter than the state, and the entrepreneur is always ahead of the regulator. And other things being equal, although governments will grow, the economy and society will grow faster. And so governments, although they may grow in absolute terms, don't necessarily grow in proportionate terms. So I'm kind of optimistic about that, and I think we are the same people. And we are the way we are because we're shaped by our institutions. You know, the characteristics, if you ask somebody abroad what defines the Australian character, informality, egalitarianism, bloody-mindedness, stubbornness, it would have been pretty much the same virtues that led to this country being founded in the way it was as an individualist, property-based democracy. I don't think we've changed. And the great thing is we can export that model. You don't have to inherit it. The Anglosphere is why Singapore is not Indonesia, and why Bermuda is not Haiti, and why Hong Kong is not China.
We have taken a lot of pleasure, I guess, in recent years seeing this model exported throughout the world, but then been faced with some disappointments where exporting the idea of elected governments as the foundation of society seemed to hold a great deal of promise around the world. But some illiberal political organisations have used the opportunity to become elected to then use government as an undemocratic institution. What kind of protections do you think a community needs in order to stop representative government being used in that way?
It's a really good question. I mean, I don't claim in the book, and I've never been so silly as to claim that democracy is an Anglosphere invention. I mean, plainly is not. It's a very old word for a concept that existed from classical times. The Anglosphere's unique contribution to the sum of human happiness was the idea of constitutional government, not of majoritarian rule, but of laws that were above the government, that meant that just because you happened to have a transient majority didn't mean that you got to do whatever you liked. And the tragedy of most places in the world is not that they have no elections, but that they have no proper concept of restrictions on the winners of those elections. And what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment as we record this interview is a very good example of how most of humanity is. There isn't really any sense that the winner doesn't take all. So, if we have the idea that you export democracy and that's everything else will look after itself, absolutely that's the wrong way around. What you need is property rights enforced by an independent judiciary, where contracts are respected and where the law is a vehicle for the individual seeking redress rather than being an instrument of state control. If you have that, everything else follows. I mean, Hong Kong had that for decades before it had democracy, and Hong Kong remains a basically free and successful economy. If you'd done it the other way around, I'm not sure it would have worked.
Can I ask you, every nation that has been gifted the Anglosphere inheritance of these institutions of liberal democracy has put its own spin on the model, and I wonder what your observations are about the way that Australians have interpreted this legacy and how we've innovated the model of Western civilization.
Sure. I mean, I just read an essay by Rupert Murdoch's uncle, Walter Murdoch, where he wrote about what should Australian writers be writing about. He was taking issue with a book review, or a number of reviews of an Australian book, saying, well, where is the distinctive Australian voice here? And of course, he was perfectly reasonably saying, well, what are we supposed to do? Were we supposed to write in a funny accent, or write only about boomerangs, or I would make a similar argument about the development of constitutional liberty here. It's not that you expect it to involve boomerangs. It's that Australia had, as North America did, the advantage of a frontier society, which meant that individualist culture was exaggerated and intensified. People from Europe, when traveling in the British Isles, found it a relatively individualist, relatively libertarian, relatively meritocratic society compared to France or Spain or wherever they were from. Arriving in a place where land was plentiful, where everybody could become a proprietor, and where there was no residue of a feudal aristocracy, Australians were able to take those things further and to build a much more individualist and bloody-minded, stubborn, all the other things, society than the place that their ancestors had come from. There was a really nice phrase that Tocqueville used talking about the US. He, as a Frenchman, observed that features of British and particularly English democracy had been greatly exaggerated in North America because of the opportunities afforded there. And writing in the 1840s, he said, "The American is the Englishman left to himself." And I think he would have probably made the same observation about contemporary Australia, and for the same reason.
What an excellent note for us to end our chat on. Thank you so much for coming in to talk with us, and thank you for being here in Australia and sharing the ideas in your books.
Thank you, Cass.